Thank you, Donna, for that fantastic welcome. It's always great to be welcomed onto country, and particularly here, sitting here looking out at that vista, which is absolutely amazing that 200 and something odd years ago, that's when that first contact point came in and changed a lot of people's lives forever. So I too acknowledge the Gadigal people. I'm a Gomeroi Murray from northwest New South Wales. Peter White's my name. I have the honour to be the Senior Manager of Aboriginal Strategy and Engagement at Create New South Wales, and the facilitator of this wonderful panel of championing First Nations leadership roles, which when you look at that actual label, you just have to do this. So I think we're in for a really exciting and fun afternoon here. As Donna pointed out, it's a very timely event, not only within Vivid, but within Reconciliation Week. But more importantly, these conversations, I think, don't just have to happen within 1 week or 2 weeks a year of Reconciliation NAIDOC Week. It should be being discussed in every second of every minute of every hour and day, that we actually listen to what Aboriginal people and First Nations people have to say and take on board what they can share for what our future will actually be for this country. And I think that's the essence of what we're hoping to actually have a little conversation here today, is what does it mean, that true value of Aboriginal culture in society? And what does it mean to listen to leadership in that space, but more importantly, understanding of what type of leadership that is and what role everyone can play. So we've already sort of been introduced, the panel up here, but a good way to start is, I think, if I just lead into a question of what does the panel see as the real value of Aboriginal culture, particularly in New South Wales, and how does your work shape this? Pauline?
Ajiwaja Yegel, Ajiwaja Gadigal, Nya Pauline Clague. So I'm a Yegel woman from the north coast of New South Wales, the mighty Clarence River, cousin to that one over there. I suppose for me it's a really interesting concept, this thing about how do we make our culture business, I suppose, in a way as well. Because in New South Wales, obviously we had first contact, and so the resilience of our mob is a little bit longer. There's a lot more, I think, strength in the way in which technology is being embraced and shifting the way in which we tell stories, especially for me as a filmmaker. I think I actually find it really weird that I'm on this panel, because I don't see myself as a leader. I see myself as a facilitator for other people to lead. And I think that's what a lot of our community does as Indigenous people as well, is that we recognise that there is bigger things for us to do. It's not just about us, and it's not just about our nations, but it's also about the next generation always. And it's also about how we work with other people outside of this space of Australia. Internationally is where film gets recognised the most, which is really weird, because it's a really quick way to engage with community in a very both mainstream and Indigenous. And I think that's why I started Windsor Film Festival, was to be able to show the celebration of the work that is happening here in Australia as well as overseas that has an Indigenous lens, and to try and help shape that lens. And I usually don't like talking about the stuff that I do. I always cut something, so I cut a little promo about Winder, which I might as well play instead of you listening to me talk for 2 minutes.
This creativity is a living thing, you know, and she demands respect.
I just wanted to kind of acknowledge everybody here and all of the other Indigenous storytellers, because without folks like yourselves doing this, there would be no space for me.
People keep asking, well, what kind of stories would you want to tell? And it's the stories that people don't know anything about. And they should be hailed and they should be honored and remembered.
I felt like telling our stories was important for people, whether it's our political voice, whether it's just our entertainment voice to let people know about our way of life, and that's how I got involved, and that's kind of my passion.
Indigenous people are the voice, and it needs to be heard, and we are so honoured to have filmmakers not just from our own country but also the First Nations people from around the globe. We are so honoured to have you here and sharing your story and sharing your passion with us.
We watch and we pay attention and we get inspired by all other Indigenous storytellers.
So I think for me, like even just the process of creating Winder, you know, it took 3 months for us to decide on the name. The name means the stars in the Milky Way when the emu head is down looking on its people, which meant it had to be November then. You know, and my aunties and my family, like, sort of kind of like, you know, I was like, but Rhoda does dance rights the same weekend. But that's what's so powerful about it, is that our stories are linked to our old stories as well. And it was really important for me to have that connection to why it's important to put our lens on the times. And, you know, whether it's dance or whether it's film or whether it's, you know, visual arts or whatever, that they all are a part of a mandate to help celebrate Australia, that helps to create the identity, and especially for New South Wales. I think we often forget our communities that are out there trying to make a difference in this side of the fence on the East Coast.
Thanks, Pauline. Wes?
The audience may not be able to see as we see out here at the moment, this vista of beautiful, the harbour and the light, but it reminds me very much of the Tench diaries that talk about the women in the Ngawi with the coals firing in the front of these canoes with their children, and the women singing and the voices travelling over the harbour, and this sense of fishing and feeding their children out there on the water. And then this amazing building that's there, and remembering that that's also Bennelong Point, where Bennelong's kind of cottages, when he had two eventually, were, and this sense of him as a figure, an interlocutor, an interpreter, a translator, a mimic. And then also, I can just see glimpses of this harbour bridge here, this idea of this another iconic structure, but at Dawes Point, which could also be called Padagorang's Point, if you wanted to go that far, this place of translation and communication that happened there, where Padagorang and Dawes, who was the first astronomer of the colony, shared language and understanding and a care for each other there. And for me, because I come from somewhere else, I come from Minjiraba, Quandamuka country, just off the coast of Brisbane, as well as everywhere else. I've got my great-great-grandfather, who's a Filipino man called Fernando Gonzalez, and then my other great-great-grandfather, who came from Rotuma Island in the South Pacific, called Fataki, who was blackbirded and eventually came to Stradbroke Island and married in and stuff, as well as my Danish great-grandmother, who then married my Spanish great-grandfather, having met on a boat coming out after World War I. That these are all stories of arrival to this country. And for me, this history that the Gadigal have here, that have then given birth to iconic images that represent the whole nation. It's no accident, I think. And I look back and saying that history is in fact the most important beginning point for every discussion. That many of us in this country have grown to accept the great forgetting as the norm. This idea of the amnesia that's formed over the last 230 years to not just the 60, 80, 100,000 odd year history or more, but also this idea of forgetting our own history that has come from waves of migration. The idea that the first contacts with Philip, that then kind of by the time you get to Macquarie, by the time you get to the Garden Palace, when you talk about Jonathan Jones and some of that practice, how much we are committed to forgetting in this country our history that has gone before, and hence that we are committed to remaining juvenile on the world stage. As a nation, we are committed to being young children forever. When in fact, I think we have, if you take the kind of early philosophical positions of the Romans, where they talked about the Terra Australis and the Great South Land, that they believed that the known world, if it was to form balance, there must be a great southern continent that would form balance in the world. And philosophically, it was built into the cultures of Europe that a Great South Land must exist. And in that Great South Land, incredible balance must be then preserved. So for me, there's a sense of looking at the long, deep history of time every time we start to make a decision about now. It's fascinating to look at the contemporary demographics of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, where we have an inverted population pyramid. Just around 50% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is under 25. And that's mostly because of the last 25, 30 years worth of policy making, which means Aboriginal babies live. You know, it's terrible to say it, but 30 years ago, Aboriginal babies just did not live long enough to become that statistic. But now, 25 years on, we have an inverted population pyramid where 50% of our population is under 25. Extraordinary. And we're about to hit a tipping point where if we are to see this continuing, we will see this generation that have role models that are in their 50s and 60s and older. We have a sense of a continuation of culture that's because of that, and we don't have the kind of glass ceilings and the ups and downs. But we also have a tipping point which can go the exact opposite way. If we find that suddenly we are wiping out the means of production for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are stopping the support structures for cultural continuity, be they through language, this being the International Year of the Indigenous Languages, World's Indigenous Languages. If we start to see that tipping point go the other way, we will then see a generation of the disillusioned, I think. So going back, this idea of this tipping point, and that New South Wales is by ABS figures, and whether they're to be believed or not, is in fact the largest population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the country lives in New South Wales. I think the romantic idea that Aboriginal culture is somewhere else, Aboriginal people are somewhere else, is a symptom of the great forgetting that we are existing in this country, when in fact the largest population is here. And therefore the deepest, longest history, as Pauline is saying, is also here. Maybe of the colonial project rather than just first contact, as we start to actually see our deep history, not just about the British, but what about the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Macassans, and in fact those from Asia that had deep trading routes into the north of the country in particular. But this idea of the colonial history that we're experiencing now, there are many lessons to be looked at in this particular part of the country. And so I'm the artistic director of the Sydney Festival, and so as someone who's arrived here, there's a point where you go, how do I create platforms that can acknowledge and if you like, put a spotlight on those very particular histories? And often that's by telling stories. How many of us know the story of Bennelong, and yet the Opera House is the embodiment of a special place to place him in? I mean, maybe not in a kind of conscious way, but in an unconscious way, that place was seen as important to build a cottage for him. He's not a Gadigal man, but this whole idea of going, that place was seen as an important reminder, and it has, through our kind of deep knowing of things, continued. This great building, this bridge that brings the two halves of the city together, or at least the two parts to either sides of the harbour bridge, is in fact on the land where one of those first acts of translation and those relationships exist. How many of us know that? And so for me, at a Sydney Festival environment, the idea of telling stories that are about our deep time, and for us to have a deep root in that, is so important. And as a storyteller, nothing exists in isolation. And I think that my major criticism of most political thinking at the moment, most policy thinking, is that we, and I'll stop in a second, sorry, I'm going to rave on a bit, but that we shrink everything down into very small, chewable, digestible moments. And in fact, that's not how we live our lives. We live our lives with deep, meaningful, long relationships with country, with land. We don't see the environmental changes in 3 or 4 years as in political cycles. We see them in 35, 50-year cycles. And so we're not kind of in sync. And for me, there's a real sense that this 25 and under group of Aboriginal people, which is let's call that a generation, is just the latest generation of, let's say, about 10 generations since this contact here, this colonial contact. And many people think that the closing the gap is the most important policy framework at the moment to see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And then once that gap is closed, the job is done. When in fact, I think the deep history says, it's taken us 10 generations to get here. It might take us 10 generations to get to the next step. And how are we embedding that deep thinking, deep storytelling into everything we're doing? And so, it's not impossible, but that's what my job is to say, we inherited this discussion, this argument from people who died much younger than us now. How do we make sure the next generations inherit that storytelling, and not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inheritance, but in fact how our deep history is the inheritance of all Australians, so that we can say we are elders in the world, not young children.
Thank you.
Rave on.
Rhoda.
Thank you. It's hard to follow. Donna, thank you so much for that lovely welcome. Jingi Walla Widaware, Jugan Widjabul, Nama Gadigal. I am, of course, from northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland, the Bundjalung territories, from the Wyable Widjabul people. And what indeed an honour it is, not only to be here to talk, but in fact to see all of you out there coming to hear us talk. That is the change that we need to see happen. We talk about leadership, and my colleague Latilla and I were walking across from the Opera House to come here, and we talked about the different ways that Western people see leadership to how we see leadership. And she's quite a phenomenal, amazing woman. And she said to me, leadership for our people is responsibility. And as I sit amongst my countrymen and women here, I see that so very clearly. It is responsibility. The mapping, the archives, the stories, the dance, the culture, the history, be it from the old people to the new world, is the power. So how do we give that value? I think for me, as a Widjabul woman, is knowing country, is knowing me. Our country story is of the three brothers. And we understand it, and we could stand corrected if anyone knows, but we believe, as the Bundjalung, the most fabulous place on earth, we believe that we are the only Aboriginal group that came by sea to this country. But it was flat water. And for the seasons and cycles to commence across this country, we had to map the song lines. We had to bring the wind and the seasons and the moon and so forth. And so we did. And we created the waves. And we've been creating waves ever since. It is our kinship lines, it is our song lines that shape us, that map us. And I hate it when we start to talk about that kinship and immediately the Western voice says, blood quantum, colour. It has absolutely nothing to do with colour. It has everything to do with your lived experience from your birth, childhood to adulthood. In their 60th year, my grandfather and grandmother talked about the era of the silences. The country was deaf. They knew all too well what it was like to live under the Protection Act. And as I enter my 60th years, I know that my grandmothers taught me well, because they told me to break those silences, that I could be anything I wanted in the world. And all I wanted was to have darker skin and be just like them and to speak the language they spoke. I will always be a girl because I can't go through business, because under the dictatorship that we lived in the state of New South Wales and southeast Queensland, under the arrival as the first frontier contact, we were told that we could not speak our barbaric language. Well, hell, that meant nothing to the Bundjalung, because we continued. We were very fortunate. We might have been displaced from some of our estates and embassy country, but we were still placed on our lands onto islands, as was my cousin here. And in a way, it was a godsend, because you'd get the mission managers that were, how would I frame it? Couldn't really live in white society and were certainly not accepted into our society, even though we tried. But we had fortunate dysfunctional people who came to manage us. So we were very cleverly able to work around them. And so our languages survived because of our grandmothers and grandfathers, because they knew the responsibility and the obligation they had to our clan groups. They are the water keepers of the East Coast. They knew the importance of that obligation more than anything, and they continued it. So it's those learnings that really embody us, and that is the essence, I feel, of who I am. But I also know that every action, every thought, every creative practice will impact on people. But we have to do it. We have to take the risks. We have to find people who trust our cultural knowledge. We have to engage with our communities to have the faith and take their cultural authority and place it on the main stage, because the stories need to be told, but from our lens. You know, we all have a vision, and with vision becomes a responsibility, and you can't do it on its own. But we come from a society that you've heard everyone talk about, the oldest living race, adapting. Incredible. You have no idea what it means. The pride, just to sit here actually and look out there and think of those people who faced that first barrage and made a way and trod that ground for us to be sitting here. It really is. I don't know the English words, but I feel every day I walk over there, I feel something so special. I am one of the fortunate of this country. But we have to carry that vision, and we have to show the value. My goodness me, if I came from Germany, I would assume that all black people live in the desert and they are real people. But then we tried to explain to them about saltwater people, the first contact people, the first economy, the first culture, and we don't exist, or we're not real. If you look at our government-appointed leaders, where is the focus? On the greed. And something I want to come back to later, because when you hear the stories since time immemorial, and you hear the stories of 2019, 2029, wherever it is in the future, it'll show you that greed does not rule our world, and we have lots of issues that we have to put on the stage. We have to have platforms, we have to have dialogues for us as a nation to work together. And the only way we can do that is if you start to value us instead of questioning us. Do value that we might have misplaced and lost some things, but by hell, isn't it incredible that we still know the stories of the East Coast? That says something about the value. But how many in society value us? Value our artwork, our cultural enterprises? Oh, we're not from the Central Desert or the top end, so therefore it's not real. Well, we're going to get over that by the end of this conversation, I think. But I think everyone sitting amongst us, I just admire what everyone does. And Peter, your mind and thought on having this discussion that we have to have, because we have an inherited legacy, and we are not going to be the generation that discontinues thousands of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of story, and story which is all about value in society, which is about healing and nurturing and well-being. The positives. We would not be here today if we had lived like the white man. We are here today because those stories tell us about environmental care. They tell us about human rights, how to look after each other. No one owns anything. We are the collective. And if perhaps we can start to look at some of those old guiding principles of our grandmothers and grandfathers and how they operated, and we place that in a model as a hub in our arts industry, then we will be leading the world, which we currently are, I think, anyway, with blackfellas, but we've still got a way to go. Lots more to say, but thank you very much. Hiya, Brook.
Hey. Mazingang and Daraga, it's ICU in Wiradjuri, as English speakers say it. Thank you, Anna-Donna. And my grandmother, I miss very much, grew up between Cowra Mission and the Fringe town, right on the Lachlan there. And then when her when her mother died, you know, her family, her younger brothers and sisters were put into cousins' families, so the Stolen, you know, so that effect of those policies couldn't affect them, and that was quite difficult. And then they came in with my great-grandmother into Enmore. Now, the reason why I'm saying this story is because we're all talking about stories of displacement, but one thing that is so extraordinary, no matter what happens through acts of colonisation, is that we are together, and our kinship systems are strong. And I just kind of want to reflect on my own childhood in a way about, leadership is so much more than, that English word, because it is really what we do together and what inspires us, our grandparents, our peers, our family, etc. And being born on Gadigal land at Sydney Camperdown Children's Hospital, it's not there anymore, and then moving to Blackett out of Blacktown, and then moving on from there out to Penrith. I was surrounded by great Aboriginal footballers, but when I was 13, my biology teacher told me that all Aboriginal people live in the central desert with swells on their thumbs. And of course I went home and Mum and Nan, etc. were having a chuckle about it, but didn't really explain that to me. So my curiosity about what this division was, what this invisibility was, what this amnesia is, even today, generations later, even though we have policies, even though we had the apology, etc., but really has much changed, has it shifted? And then I think regardless of the colour of your skin as an Indigenous person, people still see you as kind of detested in a way. I think I had one positive experience growing up. This one young fella said, "Oh, you're so lucky you have Indigenous blood." And I think I came from a good place. It was quite an unusual thing. But I remember being up at Rockhampton, studying up there. My girlfriend at the time was from Blackall, Aboriginal woman, and this white woman came up to us and said, the reason why we call you Bung is because that's the sound of the four-wheel drive. And we were like, is this a confession? Like, what is this about? And another one when I went to university said, "Oh, lucky your dad's white because you wouldn't have got into university." So, I'm not saying this as a guilt thing, as a fear thing, as a sorry thing. What I'm saying is that when you grow up Indigenous First Nations in this country, there's a barrage of displacement. Like, it's not our place, it's not our land. And then when you go home to your communities or your friends or your peers, it is. And so I don't want to say it is a struggle, but the thing for me that I took away from that, and my grandmother called me Garu from a very young age, which is magpie, because whenever she saw a magpie, she said, "Brook, I know you're there." This thing about the swell on the thumb, and then when I went to university, and then kind of through my connection through Bamali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative, and Ree's intense research on the Aboriginal human remains trade, which was like, what? My grandmother didn't know about it, my mum didn't know about it. These were our ancestors' bodies. Why don't we know about this? I didn't even know about the photos. There are extensive collections of Aboriginal people, our remains of all of our ancestors, still overseas. Museums still won't let them go, but in saying that, there are many good people in museums who do this. So for me, leadership is about the collective of how everyone comes together. All of the stories that we're hearing now about how we have to somehow take ownership of this ourselves and lead what does dance look like? How do, these festival leaders here work with other, creatives and community people? Like, it's so much more, it's a much bigger word. It's our contemporary story, and I think that I'm so inspired by the many people I meet who are working in areas like this that have been doing it side by side, but maybe sometimes your pathways haven't met as well, or you didn't know that that's what happened, or that's what they're doing. And I think, if anything, it just shows how lucky we are as Indigenous people. We are connected, as Wesley has said, internationally. Like, we as Aboriginal people are intermarried into the world, and we are the oldest living culture. And we're from New South Wales, and we bore the brunt of that as well. And Windradine went over the mountains from Wiradjuri country to confront the first some of the first fleeters who were shitting themselves because they didn't have enough guns at the time, and kind of worn off Windradine in Parramatta under that incredible deceitful moment. Parramatta was the site of the first removal of Aboriginal children. Then it moved to Blacktown, the Blacktown Native Institute. New South Wales has got a lot going on, and of course this reverberates throughout all of the Australias. I mean, AJ, who's visiting from the States, and I had a chat with Ishmael and Joseph up at Mooka Project in Yirrkala this morning, and sharing different stories about difference and blackness and culture, and his experience in the States and our experiences here, and it's this internationality that's really exciting. And I think that we need to have ownership over the local and all of those connections to the international and coming back again. And that's what I'm so proud about, being up here with everyone and seeing all of the amazing people I know in the audience who are doing the same things. So I don't want to talk too much, but it's really a gratitude. Thank you.
Thanks. So just writing some notes down there, it sort of became evident that we probably needed a bit more than 2 hours to talk about this. But I guess this is what I was sort of saying. Yeah, these are the conversations that need to be had, that need to be continued to be had, need to be continued to be thought about. And that's the great thing about, bringing a panel like this together. So I guess from where we go, we've had some great insights here, and now it's a sort of open conversation for those of you who are like, oh, what's going to happen next? But I guess in terms of, I am representing Create New South Wales. Part of the work that Create New South Wales does is supporting arts and culture in this state, and particularly championing a First Nations perspective and the role that, and this is what this panel has sort of been brought together. But I think from all of the experiences that we've heard, it's something much deeper. It's something much deeper about society. And this is what we always hear about arts and culture in terms of, the value of arts to society. So I guess just to start us along, I'm thinking, and I think Wesley said this back in a platform paper of the need for stronger leadership in that. So of what is or should be the greater cultural vision for Australia in this space. But more importantly, how do you apply a First Nation lens to it? And if you do that, what would be different? And I think we've all heard, deep time, deep thinking, deep listening. That's what First Nations leadership. That we all have our own word for that. It goes back millennia of that. So,
but take one step back from that position too. This notion of leadership is in the face of unanswered questions. Leadership provides a direction forward for answers. And if we look at the major questions facing us as a nation, and all of Australia at the moment, the environment is the number one issue that we are all talking about because we think we need some leadership there. The other issues that are being, how do we deal with and work with the most vulnerable in our communities, whether they're aged, whether they are living with a disability, whether they are in fact in a poverty spiral. How do we work in that kind of environment? And the other bigger issue, I think, is education and connectedness. Now, for every question that maybe goes inarticulated or unarticulated or inarticulatedly approached, for every question this country has, First Nations Australians have an answer that comes from many generations, again going back. So how do we look at sustainability? How do we look at environmental issues? Why don't we start with a First Nations approach? The whole notion about fire and the burning of this country. This whole question at the moment about cold smoke versus hot flame, which is a fascinating idea that, over millennia, if you've read Bruce Pascoe and this notion of orgamage, even this notion of management, land management, this idea of burning the country has created a regular rhythm of how the country operates. And so what we're now experiencing is massive bushfires, for lots of other reasons, I accept that, massive bushfires that wipe out animals, wipe out old trees, wipe out whole parts of the country, that then regrowth happens in a totally new and different way. And in fact, weeds form, weeds in many different forms kind of come out. But if you do the slow burning, the cold smoke, as they say, cold smoke happens and the animals rise up through the old trees, the fire goes through, they come back down again and maintain an ecological position. In fact, they're even saying now in Northern Territory that these regular burnings, the cold burnings, to use that term, which just clears out undergrowth, which means new growth's possible, which also helps germination of many trees, etc., that actually has a lower carbon impact than the large bushfires that we're experiencing now. Regular, low, cold burning is actually more environmentally sustainable than the large, unfettered bushfires that we're experiencing. Interesting kind of debate. I'd love to see more of that kind of conversation. But the land management, the idea of early grains which were able to provide sustenance for communities without the kind of water usage that we're now needing to look at rice, say, or even wheat and cotton differently. But this idea that there are old ways of working that this continent has deeply in its memory, that we should go back and see if we can look at contemporary ways of manifesting. That this is what we need to do for environmental reasons. The idea that we all think of the dismantling or the influences of cultures coming from overseas, this notion of who we are as a nation, the ideas of identity, that a First Nations approach is to put arts and culture in the centre of every form of knowledge transference, be it through geography, geology, topography, knowledge of the weather systems. You put arts and culture in the centre and everything else radiates from that. And in fact, it's easier to transmit over and over and over again. How often are we now seeing many Western forms of very, I don't even want to say it's conservative, because in fact conservative means to keep the old in place. It's not, it's a kind of radical, progressive kind of politics, which is saying let's rip out the things that have always been there. So for me, I'm seeing more and more that we want to rip out the old, rip out arts and culture from the centre, rip out artistic expression and replace it with a kind of instrumentalism in our education. The reading, writing, arithmetic, yes, that's absolutely necessary, but it's in fact in the creative thinking, in the transference of knowledge through creativity, that in fact every modern economy is saying we need more of.
And also it's about that not pigeonholing film, dance,
absolutely,
visual work separately. The fact that Indigenous people think in so many ways in a non-linear way, that there are 7 different ways of telling a story in the space of arts and culture. And so if people were open to seeing the non-linear way in which being able to tell a young child the same story that you tell a 50-year-old person, and the layers of those stories and how much information you give to each, and is something that is really could really be learnt from in terms of how to expand. I think it's one of the reasons why Indigenous people from around Australia, and especially are leading the way in the new technologies and playing with, I work in film, I do art on the side, because it's all about storytelling, and it's how do you enrich that story to not just be standing alone as one element, but to be all things.
Well, and we're caught in this idea that we're in a deficit. First Nations are in a deficit and we need to kind of overcome that. So there's a gift for it. Sorry, love.
No, when you said deficit, I'm going, yeah, I hear that story all the time. But it's interesting because Peter said the other day, goes, are we in a cultural war? Do we need to look at an insurgency? And I went, wow.
That was when I wasn't being a good public servant.
Before he became, the other
third
Peter, white, knee brown. No. Oh, that was a joke. No one got it. So I was thinking about that, going, oh gosh, what would be a cultural insurgence? How would we do that? And then I thought about having the great honour of being invited last weekend by the family of the late Belang T.E. Lewis to his annual memorial. And he was one of our great actors. And in those communities, our communities, Pauline in fact was one of them many years ago, all the leaders got together and they worked out, because they knew reading young children who demonstrated leadership qualities. And it's not the leadership Western qualities, but the leadership qualities where they would sit and listen, but they would hear, where they were thinking outside the box. And these group of young people around the country in the 70s were identified. And the whole issue then was about education. And so they were all sent off to big education institutes, private schools, so forth, because those leaders knew that they could learn the white system. But those leaders were so clever, they were strategic. They went networking. These guys are going to be going to school with the future parliamentarians and the future bankers, and they'll have a voice there. And of course we've seen the result of that with many across the country. And when Belang was growing up, his old people were looking at him as well. And then they trusted him. And off he went to make a film. And they had faith, so much faith, because he was a good cultural man. He asked, could I do this song? Because it's a special film and I really want to have a level of my country in that film. So the old men said, yes, we will come down and we will do that ceremony for you. We will give it to you to use in this film. That is one of the hugest accolades and trust and faith that you can get, because they saw him as a future leader. On the other side of the table, there are old people who saw him, like every leader, you have to have mistakes, but they're not mistakes. They're great learnings. And if you've learnt to listen and hear and read country, you can cope with those mistakes. So that's great leadership. And so the young actor, the old men come, you can imagine the most incredible film with this real Aboriginal dance and culture. But was, and these old people were giving their song. This is huge, right? Because it has so many layers. And then the film comes out and he invites his community and those old men, those old songmen who entrusted a story of country that has to be taken like it's gold and safe kept. The editor, however, thought it was a great song, but it fitted so much better with this other dance. And so that's what they put in the film. Belang had no voice in that editing suite. He was just the mere actor that they relied on to readjust the script, to tell the history and give the cultural authority and guidance, which he didn't get paid for. He just got paid for being an actor. He had no voice in that edit room. So when those old men who travelled long distances to go to the city to see this film of the song that was in safekeeping to this young actor, that would make a mark on their country as a legacy, that they could cross and work in two worlds, those old men got up from that film. They were hurt, they were disgusted. That young actor then was ostracised from his community for 10 years, never to return until that time, because that was his punishment for not safekeeping that song and dance. And we all know in this room how difficult it is to question a director or the editor and to have that voice as a young actor. So then he runs amok. Can you imagine the pain, the grief, your own people, you've let them down, you didn't carry your obligation or your responsibility, it would break you in half. It broke him, but it broke him in a good way, because he had the guidance of other people on country, the country where he was running amok, who helped guide him. Because our old people all worked together, and they showed him many lessons. And in his life, and what a deep honour to work with that man, even when he was running amok. I mean, I actually had to sack him from a job because he was charged up. Anyway, he finally, the time comes where he's able to return home. And so he goes back, but they're still angry and they're not going to accept him fully, and he's going to have to ride out this initiate process, which he does. But what he brings from the two-way world, he brings this knowledge of a cultural economy. He wants to make his people proud, but most importantly, he wants to give back the wrong that happened. But he wants to do it through his lens, his perspective. And so you see this cycle. All he wanted to do at the end was be a cultural man again. And by God, he did it. He went back, he took his knowledge, he gave. I walked into that community on the Friday, right? And they were getting ready to set up for big ceremony. It was amazing. And there's a table, everyone's having coffee and everything. They've even got a barista there. They are so flash, man, I can't tell you. Anyway, I go in, and you know what it's like when you go into community, a few more young ones sitting there, and I thought, oh yeah, they'll just suss me out, and I'll wait 3 hours, and then they might say hello. And I walk over and they go, oh my God, Rhoda, oh, how fabulous to have you here. Do you want a barista? Blah, blah, blah. These are all young people from that community. And I said, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing the sound over there. I'm doing the lights. I'm doing this. I'm doing all the accommodation. I'm doing the flights. I'm doing... And I went, well, there's leadership and legacy. How many communities can you walk in that the entire event is being run by under 25-year-olds in that community, but being guided by their leaders? And it was phenomenal. And I thought, when you mentioned the cultural wars, I thought, wow, this is proof. If you have the right insurgents and they have that cultural authority, you can shift it, because the power was in the confidence. Those young people can travel anywhere in the world and represent their people now. And if anyone, bloody editor who thinks something looks pretty but the song's not right with ceremony, they will make their mark and say never again, because they've been so guided in such a gentle way. And that's where the transmission occurs. It's not going, you can't do that, that's wrong. It's like when you watch dance and a young boy's starting to learn a morning dance, the men will do the women will do their thing, and the young girl, the thing, will be trying to pick it up, but they might not get it. And you just see the old lady take the hand and they dance together. And I tell you, if we could find a model where we dance together and there's that gentle, because we need to know things from the Western world. We all operate under process and models and code of conducts, don't get me started, because they don't fit First Nations. How can they possibly? We're all about family and kinship. But if we could work out a model like that and enable, the hub has these incredible people, and around the hub is the circle of gentle transmission and guidance. And around that circle is our colleagues, because we need to know your models. We need you to have the same voice we have. but we need you all to have trust and faith that we bring such a value. I'll shut up now.
I just want to kind of pick up on that. Thank you, Rhoda. That was so important. And I just think that, institutionalisation is not written in law, as in Australian law. We know black and white law. We know the history of that. Well, maybe not all Australians do. Tanamanawa and Moibahina, who were the first 2 Aboriginal people in Australia to be hung in Melbourne, who were basically doing black law against 2 white men who murdered and raped their parts of their family, were hung in Melbourne, the first people to be hung in that colony. But institutionalisation, the way in which that it permeates through paternalism, through generations of policies of segregation, assimilation, removal of children, deaths in custody, intergenerational trauma, our bodies being taken away, the mending that all our communities are doing, the mending that Rhoda's talked about. The way in which that we manage this institutionalisation is not law. It's not Australian law. We have our own laws, how we relate to each other as Indigenous people, and we share that, have shared it very generously, even through first contact. And now the reason why I keep saying institutionalisation is not law is because there is still a lot of paternalism, there is still a lot of control over not only Indigenous people, not only people working within the creative fields, but the people who want to work with us. For us, all of us to be holding hands and be leaders, to share the joy, just to see young faces today using terms like decolonial that came from South America, came from Walter Manolo, who is not an Indigenous South American, took it to North America 30 years ago, especially very empowering for African American communities there. It went up to Canada, went across to Europe, and now the Europeans are using this term called demodernisation of museums. I know that there are young people here using those terms, but something I'm interested in is sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean for us? But coming back to this thing around institutionalisation, there is this farce out there that we still somehow need people to tell us how to be ourselves, not only in an institutional level, regardless if it's in Create New South Wales, regardless if it's in, the local swimming pool or the local cafe, the kind of distrust, the intergenerational distrust of Aboriginal people to handle money, to handle cultural activities, to be able to communicate in our ways that are so empowering and so ancient, and we've got it sorted. We don't need autocrats. It doesn't work. It proves internationally it doesn't work. Autocrat equals genocide. That's what's happened internationally. It's not very friendly. And so the power of letting go, the power of allowing Indigenous leaders, communities to do that is kind of mind-blowing, really. When we talk about more remote communities on country, I would argue to say they have a lot more control in a way. There's less other people, less noise, etc. But I still think that even today, even working internationally, as I know everyone here does continue to, and people in this room, it's very isolating. Sometimes those stories are very repetitive. You go to museums, you say, there's already been 500 blackfellas are already trying to get their bodies back. Nothing's really shifted, or in some cases it has, but more than not, institutionalisation doesn't work, and it's not law. LAW. And I think this is the trick of Western civilization and invasion, and the kind of, I would say it's the, we're all dealing with intergenerational trauma. We know what that means in this room for us and our families and people we're connected to internationally. But I don't think we talk about institutionalisation enough. We might be talking about it amongst ourselves, saying, hey, blah, blah, said I can't
do this. And also
this.
freedom of thought. Our young people need to have the same allowance to be creative with freedom of thought. The fact that they grow up already with bounds and oppression on them. Imagine if they got to be in the Ferrari in the fast lane without the constraints that we all grew up with. You know, it would be an amazing space.
Well, it's also the way they labelled. I think one of the big things when we work in these big places is we have to be very aware that we have a responsibility to cultural authorities. We have to engage with the community. And we have to ensure that those stories, but we also are in a business that is our profession. We have trained for it, we are good at it, we have professionals in it. And there's often this sort of thing between, oh, it's great. Look, it was so great going to that community because I was on country. Hey, hang on a minute. Everywhere is on country. Oh, it was so great going to that community because we met some community people. Oh no, we don't need your voice. We want a community member. I do belong to a community. Just because I'm successful does not make my voice less grassroots, because I have a family and a community to answer to. But then you get the whole thing of the community project or the professional project. And very recently I was told that I had to take out 2 young actors from a production because they weren't considered professional. Now you tell me what professional is. They've been guided in their communities and been going through workshops and doing this particular thing for 3 years. But because the theatre company was regional, it was not considered professional. So we have to be very aware of the terminology we're using and how we're engaging with the community, because our communities are fabulous and we have an incredible array of custodians, and that's great, and we need to be inclusive and get their ownership. They have to have the ownership of the project. But at the same time, we have to be very vocal that in those communities, there are young men and women who've gone off and they've trained, whether it's been at NSW or Whopper or wherever. They've gone back to their communities, and sometimes they're almost totally forgotten because they want to work with the community. And so, and I'm being very blunt and frank, and this isn't, and I suppose a bit general, but I'm not, you know, but sometimes it gives me the absolute shits, because I'll go and see a product, and instead of using the young NSW graduate who's living in that community and is a fabulous choreographer and actually could work with the young people there and give them a cultural authority of appropriate movements, they've gone and got someone from the community who has no dance background, but they're the community. And the show has created, which is mediocrity. And I'm a Bundjalung woman from the oldest living culture in the world, and we have no time for mediocrity. We have time for growth, but on our main stages, don't stop my voice. My grandmother told me to stop those silences, and I will not allow mediocrity. And when is it that we can have an honest critique about the work without it being termed in some manner of disillusionment or racism or whatever? When is an Australian writer in this country going to be brave enough to put our talent and our work on the same level as any other theatre company or whatever it is, film, music, whatever, without being paternalistic or giving an overview rather than a review?
I mean, this is exactly the same in the visual arts. Oh,
yeah. People
are so scared to review. Oh, I don't want to be seen as racist, or I don't want to be seen as this. Is it good work or not? But coming back to this very important issue about community and not community, or, you know, etc. You know, I go to Bologna quite a bit in Italy, and I love it.
Fabulous.
The Bolognese. They say, oh, we've got the oldest university in the world. Lol. I mean, Australia has got the oldest university, and it's this subversion. The problem with history and anthropology and authenticity and the word primitivism, I strongly believe we need to delete the word primitivism, and I'm not joking, from our vocabulary. It creates a division between the civilized and the uncivilized. No matter if we're called quarter caste or half caste, we are still apparently tarnished with the black blood, the Aboriginal blood, which is the most uncivilized in the world and the history of the world, and this still exists in consciousness internationally. It's going to take more than a few generations to remove it. But we are the oldest university in the world. We don't need permission, as Rhoda and everyone here was saying. We don't need that.
Well, this is some of the earlier things too that's been said. This notion of going back to the constitutional recognition discussion, which was, millions of dollars and years of consultation, that then eventually, as it sped up towards the end, came the Uluru Statement from the Heart, one of the most generous documents that was saying, here's leadership, here's what we think we need, from the many conversations. And within 2 days, our federal parliament had said no. The whole idea of the Makarata, if you like, the idea of telling the hard stories, is still really difficult for those who have, forgotten it, amnesia, whatever you want to call it. This notion of, in the face of the most generous leadership ever, even then the rejection, well, in this country, we haven't had the Aboriginal, the Black Panthers were getting close to that kind of, the activism that found a violent outcome. We've always found ways that have been, in the last, let's say, 50 years, we've found ways that have always been consultative, thoughtful, generous, positive, going forward.
There's a bit of karate.
Well, ochre. Does anyone remember ochre?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So we're here going, in the boardrooms going, oh yeah, let's talk about it. Over there, they're on the highway with their bloody guns going, sorry, enough. This is why we are the oldest people, because we have a very different approach.
And sometimes our seasons are 10,000 years old. So we know what's coming next. And that's the difference, right? Is that we know that we may be talking about year cycles and whatever, but we also know that our stories go back and go forward and tell us what the next generation of thousands of years is going to bring.
Yes.
So do you think, and we've talked about amnesia and all of that, looking forward, and I think that's the thing, it's this weird sense of we all know what we need to do in this country to move forward, to get to a shared future. So just listening to some
we do.
discussion.
We need to wake up the rest of the...
Well, is it deep down do people actually do? And is it another form of leadership, of the leadership to be led, to be able to be led, the leadership that's required to be able to listen? Is that a level of leadership? Or going back to some of what Wesley's saying, the lessons learned by cultural burning.
Yeah.
Or do we just need to burn it all down and wait for the regrowth? Or is there a happy...
There won't be a regrowth if you burn it all down.
Yeah, you've got to let it go.
It's transformative. I mean,
I think it's transformation.
If you look at our communities, leadership is such a funny word. I like to use custodialship.
Yeah.
Because, if I struggle with something, there are many cultural, I guess the Western word would be cultural authorities, but there are many people I can go to and seek their advice. And my challenge working in a Western system is ensuring that voice at that community level is given the ownership and they feel included. And when they do, and you start to... I remember when I used to do budgets and I'd always put cultural custodian. I don't do that anymore because they go, what? And I go, you got a lighting designer? You're having a cultural custodian. Same thing, they're getting the same fee. They go, oh, well, no. And so I've changed it now to make it more like part of the cultural guidance, and put a little budget with it, because we need to pay people for their knowledge. These are our bush professors. They are our guides. We can't do the work without them. And there's a way of how you can involve them, include them. So there's that level of leadership. But I think if we look at where we are, and, you know, coming from the creative industries, just with that hat on, arts, creative industries, there could be the most amazing, well, there is actually, if you look at the Territory and various other places, the cultural economy is huge. We don't seem to get that in New South Wales. You know, you can watch the latest campaigns from the sponsors of Vivid, no, one said. You can watch the latest campaigns and Aboriginal culture stops at Coffs Harbour.
I didn't know it got that far down.
Oh yeah, they go but it's only that little gap there because there's an arts centre there. But so what we need to build is that social capital. And how does that look? How does that provide all the things we need from our side, like the duty of care of our artists, looking after those old people and ensuring they are, what's the word, you know, compensated. Not compensated, bloody paid, because they are the professors. So we have to switch our thinking sometimes. So I think, yeah, it's a hard one, but I see it as trust and
this thing about accountability, like they always want
transparency.
Yeah, but people always want accountability. I mean, there's this joke in my family, I'm sure it is in many families, we're the most trained people always going through training courses, you know, because you can't get jobs and then you get another training course, and then you go and do another training course. And I mean, apart from the fact that we're all very talented, you know, our families, because we did many things, you know, that's what we do. It is this thing about trust. You know, because it is a power game, and I don't want to sound conspiracy or anything, but you know, it's a true thing. You know, it is still this kind of psychological warfare over land, over who gets to lead. You know, is it white? Is it black? Is it, you know, what is it? And also the other waves of immigration that have come through. You know, there were times when the Vietnamese came and they were like the worst Australians in the world, but then there were the Aborigines, oh, they're the worst. And then you got, you know, the Africans coming in now, and now the Syrian asylum seekers, they don't even get in the door. You know, but I think that this does come back to this kind of, you know, this pecking order again around who is superior, what is the superior race and what is not. In the boardrooms, etc., we've still got the government, regardless if it's conservative or not, full of white men who are making decisions around sports and everything else. It's a real thing, you know. It's not kind of, that's not even amnesia, you know. That's kind of like in the world, it's in our face every single day. But at a creative level, the peers that we work with who are non-Indigenous, they're the ones that have the power to say, I want to work with you equally, or here, you take the field. You know, I think that there's great excitement about that. I mean, if we just talk about Endeavour, you know, what are we building an Endeavour ship for to sail around Australia? I mean,
can we get the spears and throw at them? Like when
I want to burn it down.
Let's do a reel in it.
But the thing that kind of, I just want to say one thing about that ship, because if we go into the archives, the photographic archives, and the reenactments, the Cook reenactments down here at La Perouse, where they got local people out of the mission to reenact that. Imagine that, reenacting that trauma. Same up in Cooktown, there are photos of a reenactment of the Cook, where there are photos of Aboriginal people pulling the Endeavour on like a small model. So if you could just imagine this kind of reenactment, you know, it's kind of, you know, there is this, it's re-traumatization, and I think, you know, I don't want to get lost on all of that, but you know, I think this thing about leadership, it's about letting go. People, you know, it's more. I think it's a much bigger, you know, psychological, international view on how people see Aboriginal people in Australia, how they see us as New South Wales people as the first impact, how all of a sudden we were completely wiped out.
Well, Lieutenant Cook, when he first arrived, you know, and all that kind of stuff, the notion of this historical reenactment of something that never happened, the kind of circumnavigation of the nation, it's kind of very weird. Didn't happen. But this whole idea of raising narratives up are always political purposes. And I think that the issue, if we look at the last, let's say, 100 years, this notion of everything that we try to hold on to changes so that most politically, in terms of policy development, most forms of leadership, everything keeps shifting so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, leaders, are in responsive positions, not actually strategic positions. So, you know, we just have to go back every 20 years, if you play out the history, every 20 years the Clementia changes, this idea of going, we are natives.
I reckon it's 15.
It's 15, is it? Oh, well, there we are. You know, from natives to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders to Indigenous, now we're going into First Nations. This idea...
Except government never says First Nations, because then they'd have to agree we were first.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But this notion of each time the name changes, we go, right, okay, that's what we're going to say. Right, we'll use that. Instead of actually saying, actually, you have to now start to call me a Murray. And from Quandamooka, you have to actually call me... You actually have to acknowledge my clan. And people go, oh, but I can't do that for everyone. Why don't we just kind of centralise everything? And one of my in my revision of the last 50 years, in 1967, and then obviously the decades before that leading up to the referendum, we decided that there was a united front was needed for national leadership. And in that national front, that national face, we acknowledged and accepted a whole range of things that stepped us away from the diversity we really are. You know, we're diverse in our demography, in our geography, in our cultural beings, in our cultural practices. We are incredibly diverse. But because there is a national government that sits on top of this continent, we go, well, we have to act together to negotiate on a policy level. And one of the inheritances of the 67 referendum is we still have to deal in a kind of united way as opposed to reflecting the diversity of who we are. And in the last, let's say, maybe last 20 years, that diversity is coming to the fore and is often being used against us as a way of saying, well, you don't all agree. You know, that's right. We don't. As opposed to saying, you must all agree because that's the only way we can negotiate with you.
You know, I have a question maybe to a specific person in the audience. Is that all right?
Oh.
Sorry, Chloe, I'm going to ask you a question. I mean, we're talking about institutionalisation, especially within the arts. There is institutionalisation. I know, Richard Bell's, presentation at the Venice Biennale was extraordinary. And I think the thing that blew my mind, I mean, apart from his embassy, which he just sets up everywhere he can, and the people who support him, and that had big international mob of First Nations and other there. But to have the, to have the Australia Pavilion look alike on the back of a barge and it going around. I mean, the way I saw that was not necessarily a criticism of Australia or the arts, but it's so much more than that. And people, I think, maybe got offended about that and they just don't get it. And I'm just wondering, Claire, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you've worked very close with Richard on that. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe help, people understand what that, maybe, that misunderstanding is.
Just keep speaking.
Is that mic's not working? It is now?
So the other one?
Yours is working.
Oh. I'm sorry, babe.
That's all right.
I do that when you get nervous.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Oh, my God. So, hello. Thanks for that, Brook. Kill you later. So I work here at the MCA. I'm the curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander exhibitions and collections here, and the work that Brook's referring to is a work that Richard and I were shortlisted for the Venice Biennale. Our intention was originally to wrap the Australian Pavilion in chains so that no one could actually go inside of it, as a very strong political statement about the way that we treat really about, as you were saying, displacement and dispossession, about the way that we treat refugees and migrants attempting to come into this country, and the way that we lock out our own people in this country as well. I am an Aboriginal woman from the other side of the country, so Yungar Yamaji mob from the southwest of WA. And so the work, we weren't successful, as you would well know. Angelica Mercedes got the gig. But Richard was and we're talking about leadership. Richard is such a strong, he's really, for us as Aboriginal curators and for other artists in this country, is really the godfather of, Australian sort of Indigenous political work. And really for him it was about making a very strong statement about not just sort of decolonisation in a broad sense, but really about this focus that's happening in the moment globally about nationalism and the fervour of sort of fascism that's actually coming to the rise. And so that work was really supposed to be about that. Now that's a tough ask for the Australia Council to kind of, for us to be doing that, and we understood it was really confronting and provocative, but a necessary conversation, and one in which Richard, I think, showed enormous leadership globally in terms of what he wanted to say, because that is an international conversation about the rise of fascism. So that's really what that work was about. I can understand that people felt very provoked and challenged by it, because it's a work that makes people feel uncomfortable. He wanted to go over there, he wanted the embassy to be a site that was almost like asylum or like a true embassy where people of other nations could come together and have a conversation in a very equitable manner without those power structures in play. The Australian Pavilion, it represents a particular thing about nationhood in this country, and I felt that he showed great leadership in actually thinking about that and actually wanting to also we were talking, sort of touching on succession planning and on those ideas around sort of showing the next generation. Well, I'm a particular generation of curators, so he wanted to work with me to show again that support of a younger person sort of coming through, I guess. Unfortunately, it didn't get through, but that idea of kind of sailing it down the roads of Venice was really as a bit of a trigger or a reminder that actually, even if you place us to the fringes, and this touches very much on the Biennale theme, of course, Brooke, but even if you place us on the edges or the fringes of a global, international or Australian conversation, we will always be that little black reminder that kind of comes forth and sails past and is the thorn in your side and the reminder that actually we are here, we have always been here. So there was also that notion as well about it. But I think it speaks very strongly to that idea, Wesley, that you talked about before, which I loved, which is this idea that, in fact, why are we being responsive to these conversations when we should be centering ourselves in the middle of these conversations and kind of setting the agenda as opposed to responding to the agenda. So that was really what that was his intention. That was certainly our intention.
I do that in academic. Yeah. Instead of using decolonisation, I use indigenifying.
Right.
And everyone goes, it's not a word. And I go, it is for me. Because I don't want to use the deficit anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
And so, like creating our own space and our own lens that is owned and gives us the space to be able to make the decisions and take the risks that we need to take for our community is important.
So hopefully that's answered.
Great, thank
your question.
I've got this theory too that in most kind of social structures, as we're seeing in North America, in Europe, and also here in Australia, the centre is being vacated, and that extreme positions are taking place in terms of our political discussion and debate. But in fact, those of us who have actually lived on the fringes, on the edges for so long, actually have the skills to now populate the centre. We have the ways of kind of negotiating and talking about the world that is inclusive, that is open, that is peaceful in many ways, and that the edges that are forming in or the new fringe, if you want to say that, the far left, the far right, the kind of extremism that's overtaking a lot of our public debate has no place for us in it. So in fact, we're back in the centre, and we should take our role very seriously, because before we used to think reconciliation was in fact between First Nations Australians and those who have arrived through migration. And in fact, I think reconciliation is how the whole country reconciles its history with its landscape with its future. and that the reconciliation is not about people, but about place and time a bit more. And so the more people engage in that in the centre of our social discussion and debate, the better. But unfortunately, I think there's so much static in our usual theatres of leadership, be they political or other social, or even now in our media and our storytelling. The dominance of this kind of fracturing of our debates and discussions to extremes will still be with us for at least another 10, 20 years before we find a logic that brings us back to the centre. And I think First Nations have a way of doing that. Richard Bell,
And that's all about the soundbite, right? Like, we live in a world which is about that moment, and there's a longevity to the way in which Indigenous people want to lead this country forward as well. And I think that's the reason why, I remember my grandfather used to always say, we have 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason, because we have to listen and look twice as much as we talk. And so there is an opportunity for us to bring the lens of leadership in a new way of working together, not being experts in this country, but to be able to be inclusive and to share that knowledge is really important.